Hi, I'm Yoni Appelbaum from The Atlantic, and I'm here today with Kaya Henderson, the CEO of Reconstruction and former chancellor of the DC Public Schools. And thank you for joining us here today with Aspen Ideas Now. Kaya, one thing I know is that good ideas can come from unexpected places. And I might be wrong about this, but I think that this particular good idea we're here to talk about today started when you met a friend for drinks.
It, it actually started a little before I met a friend for drinks. It came to fruition over drinks, and the drink was tea, lest we not be confused. But for a long time, friends and I had been wondering who is minding the cultural store for African Americans? How do we draw on the tradition of freedom schools and citizenship schools to make sure that our kids understood African American history, understood our time here in this country from a positive perspective in a way that built them up and gave them confidence and secured their identity. And we borrowed the idea from our Jewish friends at Hebrew school or our Chinese friends at Chinese school and said, what would kind of Hebrew school for our Black kids look like? And that's where the idea of Reconstruction came from. And so it was an idea that I had been noodling on in my spare time. And then I ended up having tea with my co-founder, Roland Fryer, in Boston. And he said, let's do something amazing for our community. And I said, well, I've been noodling on this idea of a national Black curriculum, and the rest is history.
So you had a sense that there was a void there, that somehow certain kinds of ideas, values, traditions weren't adequately being passed on to members of your community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. There were two things that made me believe that this was a huge need. The first is all of my friends who have kids would always say to me, you know, I'm the teacher friend. What books should my kids be reading? You know, where should I go to make sure that they really know African American history? What kind of program should I be putting them in? And so it was clear to me that from a parent perspective, parents were looking for things to supplement their kids' education. The second thing was my work at DC Public Schools, where we created a curriculum. When I got to DC Public Schools, there was no standard curriculum there. And so part of the work that I did was to create a curriculum. And we made sure that that curriculum did two things. Number one, it provided windows for kids to see out into lots of different kinds of communities. And then we also wanted to ensure that the curriculum showed kids mirrors where they could see themselves, their family, their community in the things that they were studying. And what I saw was when kids saw themselves in a curriculum, they came alive. When they were doing math that was relevant to themselves or their history or something they were familiar with, it was much easier for them to engage. But you know, when you're doing curriculum for a school district of 50,000 kids, you've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. And so I really wanted to understand what it would look like if I didn't have time constraints and I didn't have content constraints, and we could teach kids whatever we thought was important. And so that has led us to not just history and literature, but also cultural things like cooking and dance. And it's allowed us to do things like math in a really culturally relevant way. So that's the kind of work that we do at Reconstruction.
So this is conceived then as not a substitute for braiding many different American narratives into the public school curricula, but rather a supplement, a complement, something that builds on the progress we're making educationally in the public schools, but allows members of particular communities to get that supplementation outside of regular school hours.
Absolutely. We call ourselves proudly supplemental, right? We're not trying to displace what's happening in school. Schools, you know, I ran a school district, and schools have to do 900 zillion things in 180 days and 7.5 hours a day. There's no way to do it all. And we felt like it was really important not to give short shrift to some of the narratives that don't get told in school, right? We at Reconstruction are able to focus, more Toni Morrison over James Joyce, or we're able to approach Shakespeare in a very different way. We've co-designed a course with the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington called Black Shakespeare, where we examine issues in African and African American history through the lens of Shakespeare. We look at issues like colonization and immigration and slavery and discrimination through 5 Shakespearean plays. And that allows young people to connect with Shakespeare in a very different way than what they're experiencing in school.
You know, it's interesting as you describe this curriculum, some of it is what somebody might expect from hearing the top line of the project, that it's about particular culture and heritage, but other parts of it, particularly I'll focus on the math here, are about approaching things that all kids need to learn, but doing it through a culturally sensitive lens. Why weave math into this curriculum?
Well, we actually were looking out at, we weren't initially intending on weaving math into the curriculum, but as we looked out at what was happening with distance learning last spring when things were starting, and noticing that in many of our communities, young people were getting slim to no real instructional content, and we knew that families would be looking for alternatives. And so we said, look, let's take a look at the regular academic content and see if we can do it in a blackety-black kind of way. And so, we don't run out selling this, but all of our math courses are aligned to the grade level standards in math. So while you think you're learning how to calculate sports statistics for HBCUs, you're actually getting the 5th grade math concepts. And so there's a young man named Malik who is taking classes, and he's doing this HBCU sports class. And he has now realized that he knows what he's doing in his math class at school that he didn't know before, because he's learned the concepts so solidly at Reconstruction. And it's not like we're teaching much different. What we're doing is putting it in a context that's interesting to him, where he sees people who look like him, where he's engaged in a different way than what they're teaching at school.
So let me ask you this. You mentioned the analog to Hebrew schools in the opening. I know that although I sometimes speak about a Jewish community, the reality is that there are Jewish communities. There are many different traditions. The Jewish community in this country comes from around the world
Yes.
and brings with it distinctive cultural heritages. And those traditions coexist with each other, but they're not identical. There are elements that are shared and elements that are not. How do you deal with that multiplicity of identities when you're fashioning a set of educational offerings like this?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm from the more is better school of thought, that diversity makes us stronger. And so I'll give you a short example. We developed a cooking class called Cooking for the Soul, where kids learn 5 traditional soul food dishes. They learn the history of where the dish comes from, where the ingredients come from, the history of whether or not it's something that we got here or that started in Africa. And that's great, but that is one slice of our culinary tradition. And so we have another series around Afro-Latin cooking that is coming, a series around Afro-Caribbean cooking that is coming, a series around West African cooking and South African cooking. And we want to pull the fullness of the diaspora into our curriculum so that kids get to experience all of the different ways that Blackness shows up in the world.
What do you hear from the students and parents who are already taking these courses about why they find it a valuable experience? What are they getting out of it?
It's so interesting. So what we hear from our students is these are the kinds of topics and discussions and content that they wish they were doing in school. They also love their tutors. So the way this curriculum is delivered is in small groups with a tutor leading the conversation. And that tutor is usually a college student or a recent college graduate or a great teacher or a retiree. And so kids love being in this small group seminar with a great tutor. And then they also love being in conversation with kids from all around the country. And so that's what our students are telling us. Our parents are saying, this is what I have been looking for to supplement what my kid is learning in school. This is reaffirming to their identity. It allows us to connect in ways that we haven't before. Some families are doing the cooking course together, or some families are reading in our book clubs together. And so we've heard, in fact, that it's ways to bring community together. We believe we have to build strong children, but we actually have to rebuild or reconstruct a strong Black community. That if we're going to live just like just after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction historical period, Black people and white people had to renegotiate new ways of living together post-slavery. And we believe that we're in a similar time where we're all of the ethnicities that are present in the United States are having to renegotiate how we're all active participants in our democracy. And we think that part of that is building kids who have a strong sense of confidence and identity in their heritage. But we also know that when we are strong in who we are, it allows us to interact more positively with other groups. And we invite people to the Reconstruction table.
So I actually wanted to ask you about the name. It's an interesting name for an educational curriculum. Reconstruction is this moment of promise in American history, but of unfulfilled promise of a revolution that rolls forward in terms of equality and rights, and then is rolled backward. And you've taken that name and applied it to the curriculum. Is it that you're hoping to reconstruct Black communities, to reconstruct America's pluralistic democracy? What is it that you are reconstructing here?
So I mean, it's a double entendre, right? It is a hearkening to this 12-year period in American history where Black people were arguably among the most prosperous we've ever been, in that we own 20% of farmland in the United States. We were more active politically and consequential to presidential elections and state elections when we elected our first Black senators to Congress. It's also a time of a huge educational boom where we created more than 5,000 community schools in the Black community and 37 HBCUs, again, all in 12 years, right? And we had our own towns and our own banks, and it wasn't rolled back, it was destroyed, in fact, intentionally destroyed, right? The rise of Jim Crow and whatnot to squash this. And so we want to, one, remind people that we actually are not lazy or ineffective, that we can build our communities strongly. We have done that here before, and we can do it again. And this is about rebuilding. It is about rebuilding the Black community. It is about rebuilding the democratic and pluralistic society that we want to live in. It is about rebuilding strong young people who will go on to lead in a way that is different than the way our leaders are leading now. We are reconstructing a whole lot.
Let me ask you about a tricky question in education, which is the digital divide. This is a project that's built on digital resources, but those resources are not distributed equitably across our communities. How are you thinking about getting these tools into the hands of the kids who maybe need them the most?
So I think one of the benefits of the pandemic is we have realized now that digital resources are as necessary to schooling as a pencil and a piece of paper. And so what I see happening across districts, across states, across the federal government, is there is a huge move afoot to do two things: get a device in every kid's hands, not every family, every kid, and to get wireless connections to everybody. It is how we do business. And I think we are finally at the point where we are talking about ensuring that for every young person engaged in education. And so we are riding that wave. We designed this to be virtual so that kids, whether they were in Western Georgia or West Virginia or the Upper West Side, could have access to this curriculum, to these amazing tutors, and to a broadening community. And so I think that we are maximizing the moment that the digital divide is shrinking smaller and smaller, because what we've realized from this pandemic learning moment.
And let me ask you one last question. You've mentioned already several new things that you've rolled out as this has grown and developed. Is there any area of the curriculum where the enthusiasm has surprised you, or where you're getting requests from parents and students who'd like to see you add something that you hadn't counted on?
In a time where I think people are zoomed out on academics, having courses like Cooking for the Soul, where you can cook with your family, or we have a course called Coding for the Culture, where kids are designing apps to support nonprofit organizations that do good work in the African American community. Or we have a design thinking course called Liberation by Design, where kids are reimagining what society could look like. We've got a course called Intro to STEP that we've developed in conjunction with STEP Africa in Washington, D.C., which teaches the history of STEP dancing from South Africa all the way to historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. Those kinds of cultural courses we cannot crank out quickly enough. And it is, I think, inspiring that people want to, at a time when we are moving away from our extended families and we aren't participating in the civic institutions like we used to, this cultural connection is really, really important for people.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm looking forward to clicking refresh and seeing what pops up on the offerings next. Kaya Henderson, thank you so much for explaining all of this to us. And thank you all for joining us today on Aspen Ideas Now.
Thank you for having me, Yoni.